Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into one of the most critical chapters for your history exams, the making of a global world. Yep, we're diving straight into Chapter 3 from your Class 10 NCERT textbook. And listen, whether you're gearing up for your boards or laying the groundwork for the civil services, this is a topic you absolutely have to nail. So when you hear the word globalization, what comes to mind? Probably the internet, modern trade, maybe the last 50 years or so, right? Well, what if I told you the real story goes back thousands of years? The journey of how our world became so interconnected is a long, fascinating one, all about the movement of trade, people, and capital. I mean, just look at how far back these connections go. We're talking about active coastal trade between the Indus Valley and West Asia as early as 3000 BCE. And it wasn't just goods. Even something you can't see, like germs, has been a global force for centuries. By the 13th century, with links like the Silk routes in full swing, our world was already unmistakably interconnected. So, to make sense of this huge story, we're going to tackle it in 4 parts, just like your textbook does. We'll start with the pre-modern world, then look at the massive changes in the 19th century, dive into the chaos of the interwar years, and finish with the rebuilding effort after World War II. All right, let's kick things off with our first section. We're traveling back to the pre-modern world, where the first real threads of global connection were woven with silk, spices, and, unfortunately, sickness. You know, the famous silk routes were about so much more than just silk. Think of them as superhighways for a complete exchange. Gold and silver flowed from Europe to Asia. Foods that we eat all the time, like potatoes and tomatoes, actually made their way from the Americas to the rest of the world. But it was more than just physical stuff. Ideas, religions, travelers, and yes, even deadly diseases were all on the move. When we think about how Europe conquered the Americas, we usually picture soldiers with guns and swords. And yeah, that was part of it. But Europe's single most powerful weapon was completely invisible. It was germs. See, because the Americas had been isolated for millions of years, the people there had no immunity to diseases like smallpox that the Europeans brought with them. This quote from a colonial governor is, well, it's chilling. It shows you exactly how they thought about it. Smallpox just tore through the continent, wiping out entire communities, sometimes long before Europeans even set foot there. And for the colonists, this wasn't a tragedy. They saw it as God literally clearing the path for their conquest. Okay, let's jump forward to the 19th century. This is when global integration really kicks into high gear. Now, to understand this complex world, economists talk about 3 key flows: the flow of trade, the flow of labor or people, and the flow of capital or money for investment. Here's a perfect example of how it all works together, like a set of dominoes. Britain decides to scrap its corn laws. What happens next? Suddenly, cheap food floods the country. British farmers can't keep up and lose their land. So what do? Millions of them migrate to America and Australia to start new farms, creating this massive global agricultural system to feed the growing cities. One decision, a massive global reaction. But all this economic growth had a really dark side, and this is a super important concept for your exams: indentured labor. Hundreds of thousands of workers from India and China were recruited for plantations and mines. They were often tricked with false promises and forced into horrible conditions. It was so bad, many called it a new system of slavery. And the reality of it is just heartbreaking. You can hear it in testimonies like this one from Ram Narayan Tiwari. He talks about impossible tasks, getting in trouble, even being jailed. It's a stark reminder of the human suffering that was really fueling all this economic progress. Over in Africa, colonialism was having a brutal impact. And guess what? Disease was a key weapon yet again. So, in 1885, European powers met and literally drew lines on a map to divide Africa among themselves. Soon after, a cattle plague called Rinderpest arrived. It wiped out 90% of the cattle, destroying African livelihoods and making it easier for colonizers to take control and force people to work for them. So this whole period of expansion eventually slams into the brick wall of the early 20th century. The world was about to be rocked by the first truly modern industrial war, followed by an economic crisis that nobody saw coming. World War I wasn't just a military battle, it was an economic earthquake. Before the war, Britain was the world's undisputed financial heavyweight. After the war, Britain was broken in debt. Meanwhile, the USA went from being a country that borrowed money to being the world's biggest lender. The whole balance of power shifted completely. But this new world order was incredibly fragile. The post-war boom, the Roaring '20s, came to a screeching halt in 1929 with the Great Depression. So what caused it? It was a perfect storm, really. You had farmers producing too much, which made prices crash. The US suddenly stopped lending money to other countries that had come to depend on it. And then, countries started putting up trade barriers, which basically strangled the global economy.
The sheer scale of this collapse is just staggering. In the United States alone, between 1929 and 1932, over 110,000 companies went out of business.
And the shockwaves were felt all around the world. In colonial India, for example, the price of wheat fell by 50%. 50! For peasants who were growing it for the world market, this was a catastrophe. It threw them deep into debt and sparked huge social unrest. After a second, even more devastating world war, world leaders were determined to not let that kind of economic chaos happen again. So they got together to design a completely new system to keep the international economy stable. And the result was the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. This was a landmark moment. They created a new rulebook for the global economy, all with the main goal of keeping things stable and keeping people employed, especially in the big industrial countries. Two massive institutions came out of this agreement, and you've definitely heard of them. They're often called the Bretton Woods twins. You've got the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, created to manage global financial stability, and you have the World Bank, which was set up to pay for all the post-war reconstruction. There was a problem, though. This whole system was pretty much run by the Western industrial powers. So as more countries in Asia and Africa became independent, they started to push back. They formed a group called the G77 and started demanding a new international economic order, basically a fair system that would give them real control over their own resources. But that post-war system didn't last. By the 1970s, the whole thing fell apart, mostly because of financial pressures on the US. This collapse is what really opened the door to the kind of globalization we see today, with the rise of huge multinational corporations moving production to countries with lower wages, like China. So, from the Silk Roads to modern supply chains, from smallpox to semiconductors, the story of our global world is a story of nonstop, often dramatic, change. It proves that globalization isn't some endpoint. It's a process that's always unfolding. Which leaves us with one big question to think about. What's going to be the next big force to reshape our interconnected world?